Hello, friends, and welcome to what is the 25th edition of The Conversation here on FCTV. It's been a while since we've been with you, and we're glad to be back with you for what we think is going to be a very interesting, educational, and informative show. So thank you for taking the time. Joined today, as always, by the wonderful, the magnificent, the marvelous, yes, you, Onjale Scott Price, co-host and co-producer here on The Conversation. So today's show is going to be about racism, which is always the focus of our conversations, but specifically racism in the military. Maybe that's something you've thought about, maybe you haven't thought about, but we have two guests with us today who are going to share with us their experiences of, familiarity with racism in the military, its history, and whether or not things have changed. So before we introduce you to them, however, we want to share with you some comments from one of our people on the street. Responding to that question about the history of racism in the military, what was his experience like? So take a listen.
I can't speak for the entire military, but my father, all my uncles were Army, and it was rough for them, you know. And then I found out that some of the things that were happening to them during World War II were still happening to, you know, guys like me in 1965. And it was just rough, you know. I mean, you try to serve your country, and the people you're serving with don't want you there. You know, it was the weirdest thing. Just before I went aboard, they had a big contingency come aboard the ship from the Deep South, you know, Mississippi, Arkansas, just a bunch of ridge runners, basically, you know. And that kind of explained it for me. They called themselves Royal Order of the White Knights, and I had no idea what that was. But they tried to, you know, they tried to get rid of me almost the whole time I was on that ship. But it's so funny how life is, because along with that group of guys came a group of guys that weren't racist. They were just normal, everyday guys. And it was them that would come and tell me when attack was getting ready to take place. So in their own group, they had guys that tried to save me. That water can get pretty cold out on Ocean Station, you know, and you got like seconds to live. And on many accounts, they tried to throw me overboard. They tried to slam my knee into a galley steel door. They got my hand instead, so I survived that. At Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, one of them sucker shot at me, broke my front tooth, and I'm sure he's still wearing my thumbs in his esophagus to this day. But they sent me to the Navy medical, and to this day, I can still taste the rust that was on the horse pliers that they used to take that tooth out. And then they sent me back to the ship, and when I got back to the ship, they made me sleep out on the bow in the rain with a woolen blanket. I wasn't even allowed back below decks. And you know, even below decks, they'd give you a blanket party. You'd be sleeping, and all of a sudden, you know, they throw a blanket over your head, and they'd just beat the living crap out of you. And thank God, you know, he made me a big man, and I got through it. I suffered my way through it, and I just wasn't going to let him beat me, you know. So that's basically what the racism was like, 1965.
And what progress have you seen in the military since then?
The bottom line is they kicked me around, they injured me, made me feel like, I can't even tell you how they made me feel. And I look back at it, and it was a journey, it was a journey. And should never happen to a 17-year-old kid,
Wow. First of all, thank you, Darwin, for that commentary. There's a lot to unpack there. I was really mesmerized by what he was sharing. And so now we're going to get into hearing what our guests here in the studio have to say on the subject of the history of racism in the military, joined by two individuals well known to folks here in Falmouth, the Upper Cape, very active, both of them in the community. Citizen of the Year himself, Mr. Jay Zavala, who was named Citizen of the Year by the Falmouth Chamber of Commerce just last year. And Jay, we're delighted to have you with us in the studio here for the conversation.
Glad to be with you.
And I got a chance to meet Jay for the first time in person at the Veterans Day breakfast that he hosted and emceed at the Flying Bridge, and that's where I got to meet our next guest, Joe Yukna, who is heading up the efforts to, did I get it right, wrong? How did I do it?
It's Yuk, but that's okay.
Yukna, Yukna, okay. I want to get it right. So
Yeah, I don't want to be yucky.
Okay,
That's a good one.
Like Eucalyptus.
Yukna, who is involved with the Cape Cod Military Museum, and it was actually Joe's speech that you gave that morning that really got my attention. I know it got yours as well,
Absolutely.
Anji. And I don't often ask people for copies of their speeches, like people don't ask me for copies of my sermon. But you had some very interesting things to say in that speech about what happened here on Cape Cod in regards to the military and racism. And so I don't know if you remember that story, but I'd like to ask you if you would share a little bit more about it, if you can.
Sure. Camp Edwards was home of the Yankee Division, but at the start of World War II, they went out and were in coastal defense. So the base was open for other units to come and train and so forth. During my research on the Yankee Division, luckily they are a less racist division than a lot of the other Army units out there. But the base itself was run by a cadre of officers from the South. And they enforced segregation on the base. In fact, if you were a white officer assigned to a colored unit, because there were colored units on the base, I'm using the word color because that's the historical term at the time,
Yep.
You, as a white officer, couldn't go to an officers club because you were contaminated because you worked with black soldiers. And this it wasn't your choice or whatever, you were assigned to this unit. Then later on, in late '43, we had German prisoners of war. And one of the best jobs for an enlisted man on the base was a waiter at the officers club, because you get an hourly wage plus tips. Well, they wouldn't let African Americans wait tables and bartend at the officers club, but they let German POWs,
Nazis.
from the Africa Corps that were captured in '43 in Tunisia. And that almost caused a race riot because they couldn't believe we're using the same uniform, we're risking our lives, and you won't let us even wait on your tables. The base commander ended it. I don't know whether he let African Americans wait or whether he just stopped the Germans from waiting on tables, but he had to make a decision on that.
So it always takes one person with the courage to do what is right, and it sounds like that was the situation.
Well, I think his hand was forced, probably more than he wanted to because of that. One of the interesting things, you run into things in life by accident. I was reading a book, just because it had a dog in it the soldier who wagged her tail, but an African American who had a dog. Well, it turns out he was in the 369th, which was the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I, but they had become a coastal artillery unit in World War II, and they were become an anti-aircraft training a unit by 1942, and they were doing their training on the Cape. Cape Cod was home to the Anti-Aircraft Training Command, one of the largest anti-aircraft training facilities in World War II in America. So he was on leave in New York, because again, they were from the Harlem, New York area when Pearl Harbor happened. And he rushed back to Camp Edwards, and they brought their 40mm guns out to guard the bridges to make everybody feel safe. But in his book, he says it was all a show because they didn't give him any ammunition.
Right.
It was
Security
just to make
theaters.
it
Yeah.
but the gentleman was talking about them wanting to kill him on the boat. I forget his name, the Coast Guardman.
Oh, Darwin. Yeah,
Darwin.
Phillips. Yeah.
There, in his book later on, when he's in France, his commanding officer didn't like him, and he was a truck driver in the Red Ball Express and stuff like that. So he kept sending him on routes and missions that brought him into German lines. He was trying to get him killed, and his dog actually saved his life because he'd alerted him to a German approach in his truck and so forth and so on. But that's how bad the race, literally trying to send him to his death.
So, Joe, your exposure to racism in the military comes primarily from your work in researching history and studying and what have you, right?
Well, that and my son, his battle buddy in boot camp was an African American, and his first deployment, his battle buddy was an African American. So things have gotten better, at least in my family. You know, I can't say for the rest, but compared to what it was like in World War II, the amount of, you know, they were segregated. Units were mainly commanded by white officers with black troops. And the World War II was a great impetus for change in America. Prior to World War II, 80% of the African Americans lived south of the Mason-Dixie line. And 72% of male African Americans were sharecroppers. And I think 90% of African American women who worked were domestic servants. And with the threatened march, I think in 42, of the African Americans on Washington, FDR was forced to open up defense jobs, and if you had a federal contract, you had to have African Americans, and that led a huge exodus to northern cities to take over the industry.
Yeah. I want to talk with you. We want to talk with you a little bit more because you've got some interesting stories to share about people like Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson who served their country. But I want to turn to you next, Jay. So you're a veteran yourself.
I am.
Yeah. And what branch?
Army.
So what has been your experience? What have you seen in terms of racism in the military?
Well, it's complex. Well, I served in the Army during the Vietnam era. Fortunately, I didn't go to Vietnam. I went to Europe instead. And so my experiences that I had then, and then my interest in what was happening in Vietnam, kept me engaged in the dialogue that was happening here at home. I served in the Army from 63 through 66. You'll remember that in 67, Muhammad Ali refused to go into the military.
How well I remember, yes.
What most Americans living here at the time don't remember was the ripple effect that it had across the globe, and particularly to servicemen around the world. So the tensions that were racial in nature on enlisting were exacerbated by what was happening here at home. And so there was that continual dialogue about Why am I serving a country that doesn't serve me?
Yes.
Now, I grew up in the Southwest. No one ever accused me of being white, but no one ever accused me of being anything. They usually ask, Jay, what are you? Filipinos would ask me, Hawaiians would ask me, Asians would ask, and of course Native Americans would ask, what are you?
So what are you?
So I am indigenous to the Americas and Spanish. But in that exchange, I also had a wide pathway into just about every clique, every clan, every organization. I was just invited. As a young boy, my mother said, good things happen to people who show up. And so she would push me in different directions, and you want to learn about this, you want to learn about that, you want to meet Reverend Mebane, you have to talk to Onjale, you know. And so I got to know the leaders of the community, and I got to stand back and do like all children, watch, listen,
Learn.
and learn.
Yeah.
So I was aware when I enlisted at the age of 18 that there was racial tensions in the military, but I'd never experienced them until basic training and onward. And as an observer, depending on where I was stationed, that was demonstrated. You know, kids would go off base and come back in and be beat up because they'd gone to the wrong bar or the wrong neighborhood. And so my interaction with everybody of all races was benign. I was curious. What do you do? Where do you come from? Where do you live? What do you do? What are your hobbies? And so forth. So I didn't run into any overt, blatant racism until about a year after I enlisted. I was stationed in Germany at the time, and there was conflict between two floors of soldiers. On one floor, they were infantry soldiers. On the other floor that I lived on, we were all in communications, and it was fixed station communications. So while the lower floor would put on steel pots and backpacks, we would put on Class A uniforms and ties and go into an air-conditioned office, and it was a major communication center around the world. And it led me to, my work as a cryptographer led me to embassies around Europe, and so it gave me a wonderful exposure to the continent and the attitudes of the Europeans, particularly German, with regards to racism. There was a carryover from World War II, where the English and the German got along very well with the American black soldiers. Right?
Well, you've shared two things that remind me a bit of my own personal history, which I hope you'll allow me to share. First, as you were talking about enlisting and the ripple effect of Muhammad Ali, and how that started to make more and more young African Americans question, why am I going to enlist in a military that doesn't protect me, right? And my dad, I wanted to be I grew up, when I was in junior high school, I wanted to be a second lieutenant in the Marines. I thought that would be the coolest thing in the world.
It's very specific.
And that was very specific,
Yeah.
right? Well, but then I learned that second lieutenants were among the most killed in the Vietnam War. So maybe that wasn't did I have a death wish? But I went to my father, and before I did research, and I decided I was going to try to get into one of the academies. So I got catalogs. In those days, we had catalogs from, from West Point, from Air Force Academy, from Annapolis. And I was beginning to prepare to ask my congressional representative to write letters of support for me and what have you. And I went to my father and I said, I'm going to enlist, and I'm going to go to one of the academies. And he stopped me. Very seldom did my father say no to anything that my siblings and I wanted to do. But that day he said to me, "You're not doing that." And I thought, what? He never says no. And he said, "No son of mine is going to enlist in the military to go fight in some foreign country for the rights and privileges and freedoms for somebody else that they don't have in their own country." And that stopped me dead in my tracks. And it turned me around, turned me away from seeing myself in uniform as a second lieutenant to taking another course. And then your mention of Germany, I went to Germany as an exchange student, spent a year there after high school. And I used to go to this with my buddies after school. We would go to this Hofbrau to have a few and have some winter schnitzel or something after school. And did that for, I don't know, 6 or 7 months. And then one day the owner of the restaurant came and said, "You can't come in anymore." And I, what? What do you mean? I come here almost every day. What do you mean I can't come in? The captain at the base in Germany had said to him, "If you let that N-word come in here, I will make your restaurant off limits for my guys."
Wow.
And so I had to stop going to that restaurant, right?
And what years was that?
That would have been 1970.
Okay.
Yeah, 1970. So we can reminisce more, but I want to ask Onjale if she wants to get in on the conversation here and ask something of our guests.
Well, this has been heavy already, you know, and I'm thinking about the speech that you gave at the veterans event, and I remember going home and saying to my husband, "We have to have him on the show. Like, we have to talk about this." It was, and I still feel the same way. Like, we need to continue having this conversation because I don't think people recognize that there's racism in the military and that there's probably still some that exists. I don't have any personal experience with it, although I was actually an ROTC in college. I went to college thinking I was going to be an aerospace engineer and I was going to be a Navy fighter pilot. Didn't do either of those things.
Also very specific.
Also very specific, very specific. But I did ROTC for a year and I really enjoyed it, and I was offered a scholarship, and I had to decide then if I was going to stay or not. And I remember being in one of my ROTC classes, and it was around the time that I had to make this decision. And we were watching some videos, I don't even remember what class it was, and we watched the bomb drop on Nagasaki, I think it was. And I realized that I was the only person in the room not cheering. And I thought, yeah, I can't do this. I can't participate in this. And so that's why I ultimately chose not to pursue. I wanted to serve my community, and then I didn't do it that way. I chose other ways to do that. So, you know, I often wonder if that bomb had been dropped on a country in Europe, would it be different? Would it have come across different to people? Would they not have been so excited to see it? I just felt like there was so much wrong with that. Maybe not necessarily racist, but just I couldn't. That wasn't for me.
And what year was that?
2006.
And the reason why I posed the question is because as life goes on, there are different things occurring, and you know the situations are different. For example, during that same period, Muhammad Ali, and you'll remember Dr. King was also assassinated.
68.
And that created a tremendous tension because in big cities across the country, there was chaos, right?
Right.
So leading up to the Vietnam War, I know I've clicked my heels many times that I didn't go to Vietnam. And I enjoyed this luxury. In fact, when we first moved to Falmouth, we attended the town band performance out at the harbor. And the MC said, if you're in the Air Force, stand up when we play your tune. So they went through all of the different military tunes, and people would stand up for the branch that they served in. and I didn't stand up. And my wife, who is from a military family, she said, "You served. Come on, stand up. Aren't you proud?" And I said, "Well, I didn't go to war. I didn't have to. You know, I was playing with cylinders and cryptography." And she gave me a tongue lashing. Said, "You know, you served your time. You served your country. They chose where to put you." And that was the case. I enlisted because I wanted to find out if I had moxie, as the expression was back in the day.
I don't know what that is.
Moxie, guts, courage.
Showing my age.
Yeah.
That's why I said in the day, right?
Courage.
Yeah. So I don't even believe I'm as old as I am. So, you know. But yeah,
You are.
to
I
see,
just want you to know
right,
you are.
to see if I had courage.
Yeah, okay.
And when I enlisted, that was the understanding that I had when I knocked on their door. And the military, after testing me, said, "No, we've got something better for you." And the first offer was officer candidate school. But I had to re-enlist for a longer period of time. And I said, no, 3, that's good enough for me. And so those years following my graduating from local high school, I'd actually left high school for 1 year, and I thought I was going through the passage of manhood into manhood, and I left home and I went out to Los Angeles and I spent a year living on my own, and then realizing that I had to finish high school, I went back to Colorado and did so. But it exposed me to other locations of the Southwest and the West, and there was a much more liberal attitude there. So my circle of buddies included 2 Korean kids, 1 Japanese kid, 1 Chinese kid, 1 black kid, 1 Mexican kid, 1 German kid, and myself.
You had a United Nations.
Well, I didn't realize that until my dad mentioned it one day. We were taking a walk, and he said, "You know, I really like your circle of friends. It's so diverse, and they come from." And every Friday we would pick someone else's mother to be the cook.
You guys would pick.
Oh yeah, we would. We would all say, well, "We want to go back to Brian's house. We want to go to Jay's house," and my mother would embrace them all, right? So I didn't grow up with that. With a keen awareness of the racial divide. That didn't come until I joined the military and saw it. It was palpable. And usually without provocation. It was simply because a person was black.
As we heard from Darwin, right? It was just the fact that
It was
the color
institutional.
Right. And I remember, Joe, in your speech on Veterans Day, you talked about a lot of things I remember, but you paid tribute to the different eras of service, people that served in World War I and Korea, World War II, and Vietnam and Gulf War and what have you. And you were clear in saying that the people that served during the Vietnam era, Vietnam War, did not get the welcome, the respect home that they deserved. And one of your lines, if I remember, was, you know, they didn't decide to go there. Someone else made the decision for them to go there.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Right, you said that, right.
But that's not their fault.
That's not their fault, right.
They were treated so badly. It's a shame.
So
Well, Vietnam veterans were not treated, any of them were treated well.
oh,
None.
true.
But
True.
the blacks more so.
Yeah. Well, and I have a brother-in-law that served in Nam, and my wife has a family member whose name's on the Vietnam War Memorial, and so we've heard some of those stories from family members. But Joe, I wanted to ask you to share some of what you've uncovered in some of your research and some of your history. And
Well, let me go back to William Morris, who wrote the book "The Soldier That Wagged His Tail." He was the African American who was in the 369th, the anti-aircraft battalion. he writes later in the book where he got a toothache when they were going to go down to Camp Wellfleet and do anti-aircraft firing, and the dentist was had already packed up his stuff, so he couldn't go because he had this terrible toothache. And he said, "I'll get you when I get back." What's unwritten in the book is there obviously were white dentists on the base, and he couldn't go to them.
Yes, right.
The toothache bothered him so much, he went AWOL, went back to Long Island, ran into his dentist as he was leaving his office and had him pull the tooth and then snuck back onto the base. But the thing that's not, the unwritten part of that was he had to do that extraordinary act because he couldn't get relief from a white dentist on the base.
If I could ask, in your research, have you looked at how people were treated when they returned back and used the use of the GI Bill, for example?
Well, a lot of this, one of the things that the military service did was a lot of the people involved in the civil rights movements afterwards were veterans. Medgar Evers got his education through the GI Bill. Brown versus the Board of Education. It was the children of a veteran. Brown was a veteran. His kids.
I did not know that.
I didn't either.
The 7 justices that voted in favor of that, 7 of the justices were veterans. 3 of them were appointed by Truman, who grew up a white supremacist, but had his come to Jesus meeting and changed his ways. One of the big things was the beating of, I believe his name was Woodruff? No, I'm sorry. But he was beaten and blinded right after his discharge, and that's what spurred Truman to have to act. He had just been discharged. He's still in his uniform. He asked the bus driver to wait for him where he used the restroom. He got into an argument. The chief of police came, broke his billy club, and then blinded him with it, the broken stump. And that was the Rodney King of that era. It's starting to change. But the lieutenant for Martin Luther King, he liked to get veterans because they didn't spook easy, and they knew the discipline to stay nonviolent. So there were a lot of veterans in that movement.
So speaking of discipline, I know a story which we shared via email and correspondence about Jackie Robinson when he was in the military, and most people don't know, I didn't, that Jack refused to give up his seat on the bus when the white bus driver tried to get him to leave, and he did that years before Rosa Parks gave up her seat, refused to give up her seat on the bus. I didn't know that. Nobody taught me that.
Yeah, he was in the 761st, which fought with the Yankee Division, and the way they got him back, because he was found not guilty, was they transferred out of the Black Panthers to punish him for acting up.
Right.
But I'll give 2 Veterans days, different years. In 1919, in Amarillo, Texas, 2 African American veterans wore their uniform, and they were lynched for it.
Oh, God.
Because one of the ways you know the military was good for the African Americans was the way the Ku Klux Klan reacted to that. Okay. 1944, the 761st Black Panthers and the Yankee Division were going into battle for the first time in a major assault. The troops have to protect the tank from Panzerfaust or bazookas, and the tank protects the troops from machine gun nests and other tanks. So they have to work together. One of the Black Panthers' tanks gets hit. The commander's blown out of the hatch. He's laying on the ground, severely injured. From the safety of a berm, a Yankee Division sergeant asks him if he's hurt. He says, "I'm hurt bad." That sergeant leaves cover, drags him to safety, and is killed in the act of saving his life.
Now, you got to add some context for us there, because who was the black officer or the black person in
The
that
black
experience?
was the tank commander.
Was it commander?
Of the Sherman tank. The 761st and the Tuskegee Airmen were one of the units that were created by that protest in '42 that blacks need to be able to serve in combat situations. And it's funny, prejudice can have a beneficial effect. The highest scoring tank battalion in World War II was the 761st Black Panthers. Why? They kept them out of combat for years. So the same men that Jackie Robinson was originally trained for years together. So their coordination was much better. They got to read all the after action reports from other armored units that were in combat. They were able to develop techniques to fight the German tanks, which were much more heavily armored and much heavily gunned than our tanks. But they figured out there was a weakness. They had a hand crank traverse. So where ours had a power traverse, we could move our turret quicker and we could fire on the move. The German tank had to stop, aim, and shoot. So they had a really ballsy strategy. Whenever they came across a tiger or a panther, they sent 2 Shermans out weaving and firing till they got within range to destroy that tank. But if a German round had hit their tank, it would have gone through the front armor, through the transmission, through the crew, through the engine, out back the other side. Because their guns are so much more powerful. But they, because of that prejudice, and they also were used as bait for the tank destroyer training at Fort Hood. And so they had these white units trying their best to take them out in practice every day because the white units didn't want to lose to a black unit. So by the time they hit combat, they were the best trained tank battalion in World War II.
Somebody might say, God works in mysterious ways. You know. Well, I know you brought some photos that you wanted to share with our audience.
Well, the reason I want to really get into the African American experience in World War II because I keep running into it anecdotally and off to the side of my research. I was doing research on the Yankee Division in World War II, and they went on the Carolina maneuvers. And we found, one of the soldiers that came back with a yard-long souvenir photograph of the division, of the maneuvers, I'm sorry. There was 500,000 soldiers, and it was the biggest training exercise in American history. And in the middle, they have the half tracks and the tanks and the jeeps and artillery, a blimp, because that was a high-tech weapon at the time. On the right-hand side of this yard-long photograph is this idyllic white family. You have a Colonel Sanders, Kentucky Fried Chicken hadn't been invented yet, with his daughters and a horse and their black mammy. On the left side of that same photograph, to be given as souvenirs to troops, or bought by troops, there was a black family. They had the kids eating watermelon in front of a bale of cotton. There's a shack with a mule. And they had to cut out photographs, individual photographs, and build that picture up. Just as a total racist, white supremacist thing to show the dichotomy between the whites and blacks of the time. And I saw that, and it blew my mind, and that's I have to get into the subject. And then, of course, I researched the 761st because they fought with the Yankee Division and found out about them. So I've been keeping tugged down a path to tell the story.
Well, I appreciate the work you're doing, the research you're doing, and hope that your work with the Cape Cod Military Museum will begin to bear more fruit.
Yeah, there's such a story we're going to tell, and the African American story is hidden in a lot of ways. Joe Louis came and he did a boxing tour of America. First stop was Fort Devens. Second stop was Camp Edwards. They had an amphitheater there. But he added a fight on Washburn Island, Falmouth. And we have photographs of him from Life magazine fighting in the ring. We know where it was fought because we found an article in the Camp Edwards News. He was at the stage, and we have pictures of the stage that was used. But the reason he went there, because his tour was to raise morale for African American troops. And Joe Louis was no fool. He knew that there was problems in America. He helped Jackie Robinson out of his predicament. But he said, quite truthfully, that yeah, America's not good, but the Nazis and the Japanese are going to treat us worse. You know, with the race theories they had. You mentioned Hiroshima and all that. There were 30,000 people killed in that blast. The samurai sword murdered 250,000 people in China through executions. So technology and death don't really matter. It's the spirit behind it. And
Evil is what I would call it, yes.
yeah, and in the long run, the nuclear weapons ended the war, which saved 10 million Japanese lives, because that was the estimate of the Japanese civilians that would have been killed. So nothing is easy, black and white, and because there's other things you have to take into effect.
Jay, let me ask you, so you spend a lot of time around veterans and working with veterans, talking to veterans?
Yeah, it's just something that's evolved out of friendship.
So what do they say? Do you participate in conversations? Do they have conversations with you sitting around having a cup of coffee and talking about the racism that they saw, that they participated in,
Yep.
or they wish they had done?
In both cases, I grew up in Colorado, very liberal, very open, not much problem at the time, 40s and 50s, right? After the military, I moved to Louisiana, one of the most oppressive states. I understood when you knocked on the door of a restaurant that they'd look to see and they say, okay, you can come in. You're one of the club members. So you'll remember again that in the 60s, it was the Civil Rights Act of '64. That's right in my bandwidth. What was the other monumental legislation?
Voting Rights Act?
Voting Rights Act, those two. Those were prominent in the 60s. So the military was a reflection of really society. And I saw it very, very vividly in Louisiana, where I boarded a bus one day, and faintly behind the overpaint, I could see the letters, Negroes to the back. I said, wow, this really did occur. This wasn't a fig Newton of my imagination. It happened, right? And a lot of those attitudes were just in transition. As a nation, we were just getting to that type of legislation. And so what transpired immediately after was the Ali incident and of course Dr. King, and the entire movement became very pronounced.
And some would say that maybe we have regressed to that period again, but that's a show. That's another topic for another show. I think I want to move to our second question and see what Darwin has to say, because I want to hear what you two have to say also about progress. You know, we've touched on it a bit. You know, what kind of progress has been made in terms of eliminating racism in the military? So take a listen to what Darwin has to say, and we'll be back with Joe and Jay after that.
Quite a bit, you know, especially in the Coast Guard. You know, they came, my last year in, they started talking about women aboard ships, and I was like, are you insane? You can't put women on these ships. You know, these guys are missing their girlfriends and stuff. They're out on the water for 30 days or longer. And you're going to put a woman on on the board? It worked. I don't know how, but it worked. They came out with a new class of cutter. It was probably maybe 30, 40 feet longer than mine. And I was on a 327-foot gunboat, which is basically, in the Navy, it would have been a destroyer escort. So it was just a crazy idea for me. But now you go on Facebook, there's sites where all black women in the Coast Guard, you know, and being promoted, you know, and it was like wonderful. I kept looking at it like I couldn't believe it when I first saw it. But black officers, and so it's really changed a lot. I'm sure there's still, you know, a good degree of racism because, I mean, out here there is. So you got to figure it's still in the military as well. But somebody's trying. You know, they're trying to make it better. And I just wish they had it, you know, when I was in, but.
Welcome back to the studio. We're here with Joe Yukna and Jay Zavala and Onjale Scott Price as a co-host of the conversation here. And again, I just am touched by what Darwin had to share, but also by his encouragement that things have gotten better, and so that's good to know. But before I ask Jay and Joe for the response, I want to go back to Joe because he had a thought just after we took that break to go to hear what Darwin had to say.
Well, first I want to mention a funny, lighter story that he mentioned that he saw in a bus, Negroes to the rear, painted over on a bus he was riding in a city. Northern inner city kids, when they were down south at bases, they'd jump and go to the back of the bus because that's where you could get away with trouble and stuff up here. And everybody would be yelling at him to get to the front of the bus.
Yeah.
But the fear and hysteria that prejudice caused in the South was amazing. I just found out recently that in 1945, the state of Mississippi created a home guard to protect their white women from black veterans upon their return.
What does that even mean?
Well,
I mean, I have
one
an
of the
idea,
one of the fears was that the African American soldiers would have had dalliances with white women in Europe, and
So don't come back thinking you can do that here.
Right. In fact, they'd grab returning soldiers and search them for photographs of white women.
What?
Wow.
You didn't
I did not know that.
learn your history.
That's why you're here.
Yeah, really.
Absolutely. Teach me, please.
I mean, but in a good way. Hopefully, some of this is so stunning to you because you've grown up in a different era, you know, which is progress.
Yeah.
It's not kumbaya, everyone's wonderful, but there's progress in my lifetime.
Sure. But let's talk about the progress. What do you see as a veteran? You think the military is a lot different in terms of race and racism today than it was when you were there?
I think our entire world is better than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. You have to remember also that when I speak to the camera, I speak through the experience of a non-white person, right? No one's ever, as I mentioned in the introduction, no one has ever suggested I'm white until I lived in Louisiana. Then I went to get a physical examination, had to fill out a form, and I put C for Caucasian. And the lady turned the pencil over and erased it, and she put a W in there. She says, "You're not colored, you're white."
Wow.
Right? And then when we read our history, the Hispanics, the Latinos, the Chicanos, by whatever name, have
Latinx,
been
yeah.
marginalized as well. Not every generation is directly from El Paso's border. You know, my family's fourth and fifth generation. Native Americans that have been in the Southwest for many, many years. So when my grandparents would address us going out into the world, they would remind us, eres indio. They didn't embrace the Mexicano, they embraced the Native American side, right? The indigenous, I should say. But growing up, I was always looking for slings and arrows because I knew it existed, but it's never happened. So there was a fear of something that we'd experience, but it never occurred.
You knew about it, but never experienced it.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, as I'm listening to Jay and Joe, and wrestling with this question about progress. Yes, there's been progress, as you said, Jay, in all aspects of our society. Hey, we have a African American man who is the Secretary of Defense as we speak, right? We've had Colin Powell, may he rest in peace, was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Chappie James was the commander of, was a Red Tail in World War II. He was also the base commander in the 50s. And he rode a jet called Chappie's Chariot at Otis Air Force Base.
I did not know that.
And we have Harvey Washington. Nobody knows him. He's my buddy. He's a black kid that lives in Michigan. We have Harvey Washington.
Okay. So, and I guess the ultimate example of progress is we had a black commander-in-chief, President of the United States, right? And yet, we know that the issues of race and racism still exist in the military. So, in the final moments we have, let's talk about what needs to happen to change, to prevent the sort of repeat of history. Some of it, I would hope, would never be repeated. But what can we do? What needs to happen in the military, in society, in order to eliminate racism in the military?
Well, I'm encouraged by what I see with the younger generations. A lot of them don't even think in terms of race. And there's so many mixed race people now. It's harder, you know, there isn't that split that you have now. And again, I'm very happy to see that the younger generations just really don't think in terms of race as much. Although there are certainly extreme elements that are trying to drive it apart and all that, you know.
Sure, we think about the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, and well, the Oath Keepers seem to be a little older group, but the Proud Boys and some of the other white supremacist groups tend to be populated by younger white males than older.
Right, disaffected people latching on to, you know, crazy ideals.
Needing community and all, yeah.
Well, I think Jay made a good point, and he said that what happens in the military is really a reflection of what happens in society. So as we always talk about, is ending racism in our society. And I think that would be reflected in the military. I don't have a solution for that. Obviously, that's why we have these conversations. But I do think it's important to have these conversations and understand our history, because it's often said you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you came from in many ways, and we're bound to repeat the same mistakes if we don't learn from them.
Those who don't know their history are destined to repeat it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like Joe, I have great hope, because the cloak that prejudice hides behind, whether it's a sheet or a mask or
three-piece suit.
ignorance,
Right, right.
Or a computer screen.
or a computer. As we become more assimilated, we become more tolerant.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one thing. I'm grateful that Falmouth has both of you in this community, and the work that you are doing, the persons that you are, and want you to keep doing it.
Thank
And
you,
Jay, it may sound like a throwaway phrase these days because everybody uses it all the time, but thank you genuinely, sincerely for your service.
You're quite welcome.
Even if you were doing not something other than being on the front lines, you served, and you served honorably, and the nation owes you a debt of gratitude. And Joe, again, continue the good work with the Cape Cod Military Museum,
Appreciate it.
and we'll have other opportunities to involve you with some conversations.
As I get more research, I'd love to come back and really do a whole history.
Keep
That'd be
teaching us, yes.
Please.
Keep teaching us. Anjay, good to be with you as always.
Always good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for the time, and thanks to you at home for spending this time with us here on The Conversation. Grateful as always to Deborah Rogers, the Executive Director, CEO here, and Alan Russell, and all the good folks who help make things happen here at FCTV, for serving as our producers, our camera people, and it's good to be in the studio.
It's
right?
really nice.
It
Yeah,
is
it's
good
really
to be in the
nice.
studio. So stay tuned for another episode of The Conversation in the weeks ahead. Until then, bye for now.